So, as the title of this video suggests, we're going to talk about SSP burrs. And more precisely, we're going to talk about an SSP burr set that I think you shouldn't buy in 2024. Well, unless that is, if you really know what you're going into, I think you shouldn't buy it. And it's of course this burr set here, the multi-purpose burr set, often just called the MP burr set, or even the MP version 2. But before I tell you why I think you shouldn't get it, let me just give you some important background and context, because without it, it's really hard to understand these burrs, what we're going to talk about today, and what burr set I'd recommend in general. So, as you probably already know, SSP is a Korean burr manufacturer that has really become one of the most famous and talked about brands in the coffee industry over the last couple of years. The reason is, inside all grinders you have burrs, which are basically the knives that cut the coffee beans into small particles. While there are many aspects to what makes a great grinder, the flavor profile of a grinder really comes down to the burr set. At least 80 to 90% is determined by the burr set that's used. The other part of the grinder has more to do with user experience, workflow, and so on. But the flavor is really down to the burr set. So burrs are really exciting to people like me and other people on the spectrum, the coffee spectrum that is. Because with the new burr set, you can get completely new flavors out of your grinder. Up until recently, it was only really professionals and hardcore geeks who were really talking about burr sets and changing them. But this really changed during the pandemic. I would say at that time, the Fellow Oud was released, the DF64. So both 64mm grinders that made it kind of straightforward and more approachable to open up the grinder and put in a new burr set. SSP was kind of the first brand that specialized in making aftermarket burrs, and they made them in all kind of sizes with enough different geometries, so you had something to kind of upgrade to. Let's say you wanted to get more texture or clarity, or something especially suited for espresso. Well, SSP was probably the first brand you would think about. And now here's an important point to make. SSP usually didn't just invent their designs out of thin air. Instead, they would copy, we could say be inspired by a more famous design, and then they would maybe shrink them down into a smaller size. So this is what happened with one of the most famous of its burrs. The story of how it was invented is actually kind of interesting, and I think it explains a lot of the issues with this burr set today. For a long time, SSP had a burr set called the Brew burrs. These burrs were inspired from two old Mahlkönig designs called the Kenya and the Guatemala. These burrs were originally designed to make nice filter coffee, so obviously that's what you also got from the SSP version. Actually, my very first experience with SSP burrs was also the Brew burrs, but I got them in the smaller 58mm size. I put them in this Wilfa uniform here. The stock burrs were a bit more blended and muddy, but with these burrs, the coffee just tasted more clear, more acidic, better aftertaste, and it was just overall very delicious. Then the next thing that happened was that SSP started supplying burrs to Option O for their P64 grinder. This grinder was one of the first high-end, single-dose, all-purpose grinders, so naturally people wanted to not just brew filter coffee, but also to pull espresso shots. But what happened when people tried to brew espresso with the SSP Brew burrs was that it kind of didn't really work. With espresso, you just have to get the grind size perfect, and that's quite difficult to achieve with a very unimodal burr. So Option O told SSP about this issue, and the solution from SSP was to come up with this set of what they call multi-purpose burrs. On the surface, these burrs look almost identical to the Brew burrs, but they had the advantage that they would also create a bit more fines in the espresso range, and that would give you a more traditional espresso range to dial in with. Basically, it would enable you to choke a 9-bar espresso machine pretty easily. The MP burrs are really interesting espresso burrs, and they do things differently from many other burrs on the market. At the same time, they have a lot of the attributes of the original Brew burrs, or at least that's what many people thought initially. I first got the MP burrs after having used the Brew burrs in the Wilfa uniform for a while, and at first I was really impressed. I thought the espresso was outstanding and that it just tasted very similar to the original burrs when it came to pour over, that it had the same kind of clarity and vibrant acidity. But then I gradually started using the burrs less and less in favor of other grinders and burr combinations, including SSP's own cast burr set. After some time, I noticed that the conversation about these ones had changed online. Many of my coffee creator colleagues and also regular coffee forum bros were complaining about the burrs, talking about how difficult and unforgiving they were to use. I could kind of recognize some of the feelings, so I actually did some tests to compare them to the 58mm Brew burrs. And I was kind of surprised to realize that most of the time I was preferring the smaller bursts. In theory, bigger bursts should be better than smaller ones, so there was something not quite right. After introducing the MP bursts, the SSP stopped making the original brew bursts, but then they reintroduced them again recently. So I actually ended up buying a set of 64mm SSP brew bursts with the exact same red speed coating as these ones here. And I was a little bit anxious because new bursts are pretty expensive, and I was worried maybe I was just going to get more of the same. But now, after having had the brew bursts for a while, I have to say that they just taste a lot better than the MPs. At first sip, both of these burst sets taste pretty much the same way. Very clear, a bit sharp and acidic with a lot of clarity. But then after a while, you just realize that the brew bursts have an edge. When you let the cup cool down for 5 minutes, then the brew bursts are just smoother and cleaner. The mid notes just extend further into the aftertaste, and there's a natural progression from start to finish. With the MP burst, that's usually not how it is. You start very impressive, but then midway it gets a bit more astringent and a bit less sweet, and then the aftertaste is not quite lingering. If you're very experienced with the MP burst set, you can minimize this astringency, but it's still there to some degree. If I have to explain why the MP burst can be very fascinating at first, I'd say it's a little bit like that famous Coke versus Pepsi experiment, where people would usually prefer a small sample of Pepsi because it's sweeter, but then when you have to drink a whole cup, more people tend to like the Coke because it's less sweet and more balanced. So I think the same way that you can be analytical about the MPs and be impressed at first, but somehow still be a little bit disappointed with your day-to-day coffee. And when you think about the differences, it does make some sense. The MP bursts are designed to create some more fines, and when you brew at the pour range, they probably do the same thing, or at least that's a good theory. Recently I got the DI Fluid Omni, which is a particle analyzer, and I tried to compare the two burst sets, and I expected to see some difference, but it kind of annoys me to say that the particle size distribution data doesn't really back this up. It's not like a massive difference in fines, so there's got to be something more at play. Maybe I'm not skilled enough at interpreting the device, or maybe it's just not that useful for these minor details. Anyway, so this isn't just me saying, trust me bro, I'll explain how I do taste comparisons. In general, when I compare two grinders or burst sets, I'll use 2 or 3 Hario Mugens compared with the Hario Switch bases, and that way I can really completely control the extraction and have something very repeatable and consistent. Then I taste the cups blindly, and then I make sure the TDS is identical with a refractometer. If you don't use a refractometer, it's very easy to end up picking the cup with the higher TDS, so this is quite crucial. And then I just repeat this experiment a good handful of times until I have a clear picture. So that's why I wouldn't just do a blind test on camera, because doing it one time without really ensuring consistency and identical extraction, you're just kind of spinning the roulette. But after doing this many times, I'm quite confident in saying that the SSP brew bursts are excellent pour over bursts, and that they are also a lot more forgiving than the MP bursts. So as it is currently, I would suggest that if you want to get a burst set from SSP for pour over, then avoid the MPs. Go for the brew burst or the cast burst instead. Both are really great burst sets for filter coffee. MP bursts are still good if you know what you're getting into, and especially if you want to brew light roast espresso, they are great for that, but that's kind of a niche underground thing. That's not what most people actually want to do. The pour over can be good, but it requires a lot of experience and it can still be divisive. By the way, I have a big blog post about SSP bursts where I go into more details about the pros and cons of the bursts that I know. I'll put a link to it down below if you want more specifics. I know brands like Fellow and others offer SSP MP bursts as a kind of standard upgrade option you can choose, but I don't think that it makes a lot of sense since the Fellow Ode is supposed to be a brew grinder, so it would be better just only ship it with SSP brew bursts. I know I have said many good things about the MP bursts in the past, and so have many other coffee creators, but I think we're at a point where the coffee community is just more mature, and as a whole we just understand these bursts a lot better. They're still good bursts, but they shouldn't be the default option for most people. If you're going to brew filter coffee 80 or 90% of the time, then just get the cast or brew bursts instead. That's my opinion, and I'd love to get a conversation going, a discussion down below. So please share your experience. If you have tried the MP bursts or the brew bursts, I'd love to hear from you. That's all I have today. I'll see you in another coffee video very soon.